Let's talk about what happened in Sweden in 2025. There's been some good and some bad. And honestly, there's been a lot of bad stuff. The year started off pretty badly in January with a sabotaged underwater cable between Gotland and Lithuania. It wasn't the first one, and it definitely won't be the last. We don't know who did it, and I'm not saying that it was Russia, but everyone knows that it was Russia. They're a bit like stupid children in that way. What? We didn't do it. You have no proof. And all the adults in the room just give them a tired look. And things didn't improve in January when a man called Salvan Momika was shot as well. He was a controversial figure and he stirred up a lot of hatred from the Muslim community all over the world. But it's of course despicable that he was killed, and even more, or at least as despicable, that it was celebrated by hundreds or even thousands of people online. Those people disgust me. Either way, I made a video all about that whole debacle with Salvan Momika earlier this year, so if you want more information, check it out. Now let's move on to February. Surely things improved in February, right? Of course not. In February, there was a school shooting in the town of Örebro and 11 people were killed. There was a lot of speculation about the motive behind the shooting. Some believe that it was racism that was behind it all, and some speculate that he was simply insane and wanted to kill people. Officially, there's been no connection to either terrorism, organized crime, or any specific ideology. Anyway, I made a video about that shooting as well, so once again I refer you to that video if you want to get a deeper analysis of this particular Swedish tragedy. But more things happened in February, for example a mass car crash on Road E18. More than 100 people ended up in hospital due to that crash, and there were other accidents as well that same day on Road E4. Basically, there were freak snowstorms all over Sweden that day. Trump also had a pretty weird and heated discussion with Zelensky in February. And all Swedish parties protested against Trump's treatment of Zelensky, including the Sweden Democrat Party, surprisingly enough, even if they're the most pro-Trump party in Sweden. But okay, something good also happened in February. Princess Ines was born, daughter to Prince Carl Philip and Princess Sofia. So yeah, it's not all completely miserable. Just almost. March did actually have some good news after that awful start to 2025. Saab is a Swedish company behind a lot of military hardware, for example the JAS 39 Gripen fighter jet. They were doing quite well in the beginning of 2025, especially after Europe announced plans to increase military spending. You could almost hear all the Saab bosses giggling with glee about all the upcoming sales. And after all the freak snowstorms in February, we actually got a freak heat wave in March instead. Bad news for the people who wanted to do some skiing, but good news for everyone else. But of course, there's not a single month with just positive news, because there was a water leak in the town of Jönköping and it left the town flooded. Not like super flooded, and it wasn't the whole town, but it was still a pretty bad event and many buildings were damaged. April did actually have some good news. As I'm sure you know, Sweden doesn't use the euro, we use the Swedish krona, the Swedish crown. And in April 2025, the Swedish krona was actually the currency that held up best against all other currencies. So we have a strong currency, that's a pretty good thing, and it actually seems like we're ending the year still going strong. But let's go back to negative things. Sweden actually had the third highest unemployment rate in Europe during April. It's not exactly a perfect time to switch jobs in Sweden, in other words. I'm definitely staying put where I am. Oh, and speaking of horrible things, Russia's war against Ukraine is of course still going strong, unfortunately. And speaking of Ukraine, there's a village in Kherson called Gammalsvenskby. The name literally means Old Swedish Village in Swedish, and it was founded by Swedish immigrants in 1782. Actually, those immigrants came from Estonia, but since Estonia was Swedish back then, it was basically a group of Swedes. Ish. That village has endured a lot of hardships over the centuries, and even more so in recent years. So Sweden sent a little bit of extra support to that village in particular in April. Gotta support our old Swedish territories, right? Even if it wasn't really Swedish territory at all, but yeah, you know what I mean. Anyway, it didn't really go all that well for that village despite the support we sent in April. So yeah, let's move on to what happened in May. Bara bastu, hej det på så svettig bara yr, wow, bara bastu, ja. If you're feeling slightly confused right now, it's because you're not a Eurovision Song Contest fan. Bara bastu was Sweden's contribution for 2025, and many people thought that we had a good chance of winning Eurovision. Of course we didn't, but for a couple of months we had sauna fever in Sweden. And even more music news. In May, the Swedish band Ghost topped the Billboard 200 chart with the album Escalated. It's the first time a Swedish band topped that chart since Ace of Base in 1993. And speaking of the Billboard chart, the first Swedish single to ever top the chart was Hooked on a Feeling in 1974. Yeah, pretty useless info, but now you know. Other good news is that more people in Sweden are reading a book at least once per week. That does include audiobooks though, which I'm really thankful for, because it's been ages since I read a physical book. And even more good news, the terror threat against Sweden has been lowered from a 4 to a 3. We've had a lot of angry Muslims lately, you know, with Koran burnings and stuff like that, and tensions have been running high. Not just within Sweden, this is also what the international Muslim community has thought about Sweden. But either way, that threat level was lowered in May, so at least people are slightly less angry. June marks the beginning of the Swedish summer, and I think that it was actually a pretty crappy start to the summer. If I recall correctly, I think that June was actually pretty cold and rainy. Swedish summer weather is always a complete gamble. And we also had another reason to be miserable in June, because the Moonhouse crashed. The Moonhouse was an art project to put a tiny Swedish red cottage on the moon, and, well, the landing was a bit of a disaster. Technically, the house is on the moon, but it sort of crashed there. And as usual, I made a video all about the Moonhouse as well, so yeah, go check it out if you haven't seen it. Other tragic news include that the Petson and Findus books were banned in Russia. And it wasn't actually because they contain horrible Swedish propaganda about being nice and kind to each other. Nope, it's because they were translated by a foreign agent, which means anyone who has ever gotten financing from outside of Russia. I'm just gonna roll my eyes at that. Silly Russians. They're almost turning into as much of a punching bag for me as the Danes. July is typically a time when Sweden closes down completely. Everyone sods off to vacation and tries to enjoy the sunshine, if there's any to be had. And this year, there was actually quite a bit of sunshine. It turned out to be a pretty warm July, with a freak heat wave up north. Unfortunately, that heat wave came after my road trip in summer, so I didn't get to experience it at all. And due to the heat, there was also a water shortage in Stockholm. It wasn't really anything serious, but still, it's not something we're used to in Sweden. But even if there was a water shortage, there was also a surprisingly large number of drownings. Most likely because everyone was out there swimming this July. The rescue services issued a public statement that basically said, "Enough! Stop it with all these bloody drownings!" I'm paraphrasing just a little bit. Aside from that, there was of course tons of festivals and parties all over Sweden. And unfortunately, there was also more crime than usual. I'm not sure if those two are connected. There was also a report that the nativity in Sweden has decreased. Fewer children are born. So yeah, we essentially have the same problem as Japan. I hope that a pleasant summer made more people do something about that. I guess we'll see in a couple of months. Other news in July was that a new law was introduced to make it illegal to make fun of police officers. The law was probably well-intentioned, but it's also been ridiculed quite a bit. And it's definitely been effective. Lots of people have been arrested for saying naughty things to police officers. We have an old children's rhyme that goes "Police, police, potatisgris," and one man was arrested for repeating that to an officer. It just means police, police, potato pig, and it's probably the most harmless insult you could ever say to anyone. So yeah, lots of people got arrested, but a lot of people were deemed innocent as well. And speaking of lawbreakers, a woman took care of 2 hare kids, 2 bunnies that she found out in the woods. She was found out and then she was sentenced for breaking a hunting law. That's a bit sad, but even more sad is that the bunnies were also sentenced to death. Their crime? They were too tame after the woman had taken care of them. So yeah, that was definitely a sad summer story in Sweden. Let's talk about August instead. The main story in August was Kiruna's church move. The church is more than 100 years old and it's a major tourist attraction up north. And they decided to move the entire church because the mines underneath the town are expanding. So yeah, that became a bit of an international sensation. Everyone wanted to see the church on wheels. The state epidemiologist complained that Sweden's health agencies are lacking in medical knowledge. Maybe we should do something about that before the next big plague comes, like the one in 2020. There was also a big debate about who should own a meteorite that landed in Sweden. But in August it was finally decided that the count who owned the land did indeed own the meteorite. That took 5 years of legal battles, by the way. It seems like it should have been pretty obvious from the start, right? Oh, and a cow was also stuck in a well around the area of Uppvidinge. Very exciting news, right? Yeah, as you can tell, not much happened in August, so let's move on to September. The Israel-Palestine conflict is a big thing in Sweden, and a minister was harassed by Palestine supporters on his way home. It caused a bit of an uproar that he was walking completely unprotected and things could have gone badly. Thankfully, those people were just shouting a bit and not doing anything violent, but it still raised concerns about the safety of politicians. And speaking of politicians, Sweden's Minister of Health collapsed during her inaugural speech. Yep, that's as stupid as it sounds, and it also caused quite a few news stories all around the world. But she's fine now, no worries. It does seem like it could be a sort of simile or a metaphor though, doesn't it? We had a cold June, a warm July, a cold August, and then a very warm September. I don't even know what to say, the weather in Sweden is all weird these days. Oh, and speaking of Israel and Palestine, Greta Thunberg, along with other people, tried to go to Palestine with a boat. Again. She had already tried that once to deliver supplies, but she was stopped by Israeli forces who invented some reason to stop her. I guess it doesn't hurt to try once more. September was also a month when people talked about Sweden's economy. And it's not doing great. High unemployment, lots of inflation, lots of bankruptcies, and so on. If people on Reddit are to be believed, the job situation in Sweden is still not as bad as the one in the US. But it's not exactly great either. Pretty far from it. October had a lot of bad and worse news. No, not really. It had a lot of good and bad news. There were tons of drone incidents all over Scandinavia, and several airports had to shut down because of it. No one is saying that Russia is behind it, but who else could it be? But as a positive thing, that's made Sweden sell drone defense systems to Denmark, so silver lining at least. And we're also gonna sell 120 JAS 39 Gripen to Ukraine, which is a pretty damn big deal. But it'll take a long time to happen, and there are still countries that could oppose the deal because they want to sell their own planes instead. The US. There was also a pretty tragic story about the Chicken Nugget Man in October. A Swedish guy with a mild learning disability got pretty famous on TikTok because he likes chicken nuggets. But then a lot of kids started accusing him of being a little bit too friendly with young girls. In the end, it seems like he actually hasn't been doing any of that. It was all just rumors and cyberbullying. But he was assaulted as a result of these rumors, and in a weird twist of fate, it turns out that the PDF hunter who assaulted him was actually in possession of underage photos himself. All in all, that's just a completely tragic story about the dangers of social media, I guess. Oh, and I mentioned that Greta Thunberg tried to reach Palestine by boat, but she ended up in a prison in Israel as a result of that. After she was released, there was a lot of discussion about the unnecessary cruelty of the Israeli guards. But that didn't really stop Greta Thunberg, because as soon as she landed in Sweden, she went straight to another Palestine demonstration. Anyway, I'm not touching that whole Israel-Palestine thing with a 10-foot pole. I'm not going near that thing. November saw the first snow in Sweden, but then it got warmer again, and it was actually quite a warm November and beginning of December. Saab is selling air defense systems to Lithuania, so things are definitely going well for the Swedish defense industry. And an 18-year-old man was planning a terror attack in Stockholm, but thankfully he was caught. So hopefully it means that the Swedish intelligence agencies are also doing a good job. But the biggest event in November was of course the tragedy of the bus that ran into people on Östermalm. 3 people were killed and several more were injured. People of course speculated about the reasons and the motivations behind it, but in the end it seems to have been just an accident. A very tragic accident, but I think that it's good to be reminded that not every bad thing that happens has to do with politics or ideologies. I'm recording this in the middle of December, so I really hope that nothing major has happened in the last week or so. But there's still plenty to talk about regarding December. Stockholm has a lot of houseboats, and it makes for an awesome view when walking around the city. But one of those houseboats sank in December, and it's not a great time for it because the water is freezing. And speaking of water, there was also a burst water pipe in the town of Ramlösa, and the whole station was flooded. Which is pretty ironic for a Swede, because Ramlösa is a very famous brand of fizzy water. Aside from that, there was less inflation than expected in December. Not super good, like 2.3% instead of the expected 2.5%. But it's still better. Regardless of that, the job market is still tough, and there's a lot of unemployment. If you're thinking of moving to Sweden, I'd recommend that you wait a year. Let's see if 2026 gets better. There's also a bit of chaos in politics right now. Not like super big scandals or stuff like that, but just general chaos. Elections are coming up in 2026, so every party is rushing to try to pretend that they're doing things to improve Sweden. Of course, while they're also trying to hide all the scandals and all the bad things they're doing. No party is agreeing with any other party, and people are leaving or getting kicked out all over the place. I have a suspicion that we're gonna have a hard time forming a government in 2026, regardless of which bloc that wins. We typically have left-wing blocs and right-wing blocs, and the Sweden Democrats not being accepted by either. That's because of their roots as a racist party, but they've gained a lot of supports in the last decades. And they've also done their best to try to clean up the party, even if their brown roots are still showing at times. So yeah, I predict that 2026 is gonna be quite messy, with shifting alliances and shifting allegiances. But I think that I have to end this video with some positive news. Pippi Longstockings turns 80 in 2025, and that's definitely something to celebrate. And I think that I need to mention that even if 2025 has been filled with misery and scandals and tragedies, Sweden is still an amazing and beautiful country. Let's not forget that. So thank you for following me through this 2025 retrospect. I hope you found it interesting. Like and subscribe, but most importantly, Merry Christmas. No. Most importantly, have a great day.